I'm really excited about this. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time, and we got a good crowd here. I'm sure everybody's got a lot of questions for you, but I'd like for you to kind of go into your background. How you came to like be in the hunting space, how you grew up, that kind of stuff first, and then we'll dive into the to how to get in on mountain bucks consistently.
Cool. Well, thanks for everybody coming here and for you guys inviting me to be able to talk. And I just been very lucky to grow up in an area that was all big woods and mountains. Actually, I didn't know those terms until I would leave the area. I just thought that was just deer hunting, as far as not having agriculture around and just hunting endless amounts of timber and terrain there. But I've been very blessed to have a family that's so into it and have taught me from a young age. So like it for me when I was going in and doing the podcast and everything, most people don't have that and have that ability to be able to learn from mentors like that are within their family or close friend group. So to be able to share some of that stuff just through years of experience is kind of what my goal was with it.
Amazing, amazing. So, I guess moving into this, like a lot of people here, a lot of people here to see you specifically. You get on big deer regularly. And as we were talking earlier, there's a lot of different things that are difficulties into going into this stuff. So can you kind of give our audience an idea of what are some of the difficulties in the big woods that you face as you kind of develop things?
Yeah, and I want to start off by saying I don't, a lot of times, when I talk to people, they'll be like, "Man, it seems like the areas that you hunt just have big bucks, and you're able." And it's like what we were talking about this last night. Not it's not as much about the areas as much as learning the areas. I truly believe that most places have big deer. It's just being able to find them within that bigger area and just learning those spots and spending time doing so to be able to find them. So like I wanted to start off by saying that because there's a lot of times it's like I need to find that magical place, that magical location to go to, and most of the time it's not that. Now, is there portions of different states and places that have bigger deer? Yeah, most definitely, but it's not that I'm really hunting exceptional, deer as far as what the country looks like, but being able to find that older age class, whatever's on their head may be different depending on the place, but that was something I wanted to start with. But the difficulties is really the main one and difference between the farm country and everything. There's just no destination food source for the most part. So it's like the pattern ability of it is super difficult. And trying to find, consistent, oh, this is where this buck's bedded at, or this is where he's going to feed at. That stuff a lot of times is just not as consistent. So when I look at the pattern side of it, I don't look at it as much of like, all right, this deer's going from this bed to this food source and he's doing that 3 days in a row. More so I'm looking at it from an annual timeline and learning these locations as far as like, okay, these spots or these scrapes get hot at certain times of the year and learning that and going back and repeating that because a lot of times in those big wood settings you'll find those things that are repeatable year after year after year.
Yeah, and I also want to, before we go into the weeds here, because we have a lot to talk about here. I wanted to just touch on that. You got East meets West Hunt, um, both your podcast, your YouTube channel, and everything, and you've been doing a lot of great stuff. I think the crowd today and the people coming in to the expo today and talking to you all the time are a huge testament to what you've done to get people into hunting and just the way that you've shown a lot of that. So beyond what we're going to be able to share with you today, Beau has a lot of really, really, really good stuff on his podcast and YouTube channel that you'll be able to see a lot of these things into account. So I wanted to touch on that and make sure that you guys are pointed to that resource as well, because that's going to cover more than this podcast will, but we'll do our best today. Um, with pattern ability and having no destination food source, I find that most hunters are operating 3 quarters of the year based on a bed to food pattern. And it's pretty hard to get on a bed to food pattern when that food source is constantly changing. Deer can eat pretty much anything. It seems like, that they're like a walking trash compactor. And do you find that while most areas people say the rut is less consistent, do you find more consistencies with movement during the rut? And then how does that change when you're talking about an area getting hot versus when you're hunting a specific deer and you're trying to be on that single deer's pattern?
Yeah, I think the rut is definitely more consistent in places. Now, where I'll say that there is a caveat to that. If you're in a place where there's not much vegetation diversity and it's mostly oak ridges across the board, and then one year there's a really good mass crop, and then the next year 4 miles away there's a mass crop, well, that can change things versus areas that have a bunch of vegetation diversity. What we'll talk about is I look for places that aren't really focused on that mass crop because that's such a small part of their diet, but having all the different browse sources that keep them there, that it's a good for year after year to come back to. And that's something that I find that yields that consistency for year after year during the rut. And also in areas with lower deer densities and some of these remote places, some of those does are getting older, so they're in those same places year after year after year. And that's what, I'm timing a lot when it comes down around the rut, is figuring out like when those doe groups are coming in. Because and you don't have to know exactly when that doe comes in, but you can start to tell whether it's personal, seeing it in a tree stand, or from trail camera data to be able to see like, okay, why was there all of a sudden 4 bucks on my camera? Sometimes it doesn't have to be in daylight. It just, they're coming through. It's like something is happening here, and that's where I start seeing those patterns from year to year.
Mhm. So I'm going to ask a question right after I'll ask another one. But it's about kind of what you're selecting your properties for, what you're selecting the areas you hunt for. And we talked a little bit about this, but what are the things that stand out to you in a map that say, hey, this is an area that I need to go to and check out, or maybe this is a property that stands out amongst the rest?
Yeah, I mean, 'cause it's tough when you look at something that's like, 40, 50,000 acres or big chunk. To me, to really just dumb it down for myself, I try to find where there's the most colors on the map. So the most vegetation diversity, where you can find conifer trees, clear cuts or mountain laurel, or these different edge habitat and different things that create food sources and cover that are all in particular locations. And I start with that, but then I'll go through and I'll mark 5, 6, 7 spots that I find like that, and then I switch over to what does the access look like? Where are zones of pressure essentially? Like where is that coming from? Do I think this is a super easy to access spot that there's going to be people? And it doesn't always mean that it has to be 2 miles from a road or anything, but it's like what am I thinking that it's going to be with that access? A lot of times that'll be outlining where the roads are that are around a particular area, and it's like, oh man, like that's going to be really difficult to get away from people. But there's those places that you can find with that. And if a spot meets those two criteria, then it's like, okay, let's go in and look at the terrain and see if I can find those locations that terrain meets close to those vegetation edges. And that's not the end all be all saying I'm going to hunt those places, but I drop pins, and that's when it's time for me to go in and scout and put together a scouting plan to go in on the ground and start looking for it.
And you have a really, really great process for this too. We just went over rough topics before, and I was already like taking notes for myself of like how can I incorporate this into my game. But um, even taking a step back, you talked about how you're looking for a lot of diversity, different colors, and things like that. To me, that sounds like the Bucks have a lot of different options. It sounds like there's a lot of different features, both terrain based and both vegetation based, that they can bet on. With all those different options, what kind of habitual nature are you seeing with Bucks? Like, how often are they betting in similar areas? How often do you see them shifting? Kind of touch on that.
So I'll say in areas that are the steeper the terrain, the more consistent that I find bedding. In lesser areas. So say if you have something that's like 1,000 feet from top to bottom, steep ridges that are coming through, you might find more consistent bedding in those locations versus areas that are maybe 400 feet from top to bottom, or more flatter type stuff. And a lot of that browse, because a lot of these deer, it just seems like they're on like these rotations. I don't know if it's a 5-day rotation or 7. I'm not going to put a number to it, but they just kind of move around because they can browse and eat and bed down in a lot of good places, so they have, multiple bedding areas per se versus singular beds. And it's very different depending on, again, how that lays out in the specific deer. But most of the time I'm looking at bedding areas per se versus a singular bed that you might be able to find in other places with more broken terrain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to with that diversity, like they're not honed to that single where another situation, there might be a single risen point that they literally can't bed anywhere besides that foot.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about bedding areas, you're finding these bedding areas. Is bedding a very large portion of your strategy?
It really depends. Like, so in the earlier types, I'll break that down into kind of the times of the season because I think that's important. Earlier in October, the buck bedding areas are what I'm trying to focus on, but I'm not really focusing on hunting again those beds. I'm trying to find a prominent thing. Typically for me, it's a big scrape that is leaving, is close to where I think they could potentially be bedding. I mean, there's a lot of times I don't know where that buck is bedding. I'm using ideas based off a sign, and maybe I find multiple beds and some big rubs and some thicker cover that looks like a place like a buck could lay down in. And then I wanna focus on that sign as far as that scrape to put my effort into and hunt it multiple days if possible versus hunting over that bed. And the way, actually, we just talked about it on this past week's podcast that we had done. I had a guest on, Paul Putera, and he explained it really well. It's kind of like backing off to it where things cross, so you have a better chance of a deer. He could be laying here, 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 but this is kind of the central point of leaving and going out to where he's going to feed at night or do anything there. So that's kind of what I'm looking at, and having that close to cover in the early season. In as far as bedding goes, that and you start getting in really mid-October and through November. Now I'm focused on where the does are, and that's when I'm focusing. I might focus on specific doe bedding groups, scrapes that are located next to those areas, and then the peak of the rut, I'm kind of getting in the middle of all that, trying to connect those dots and find those terrain funnels or features that I believe that they're going to travel between. And late season, now that's when I think bedding is the most predictable because the foliage is gone for the most part, other than beech and conifers and things that hold. Conifers obviously all year, but beech will hold all the way into March and sometimes into April until the next leaves start to come on. And those places are like, okay, now you can start to find those bedding areas a little bit more, I guess, easier to be able to find than in the early or the middle of the season.
And it sounds like we started off talking about the difficulties of big woods hunting, and there's a lot, and we've talked about it for a bit now, but it sounds like you're basically taking a situation that if you took it from a 30,000 foot view, it's really unpredictable, it's varying, it changes frequently, and it sounds like you're just simplifying it down. It sounds like you're identifying like the criteria that you're looking for, the terrain, the features you're looking for, and you're just making this like a really digestible thing, which is what seems so valuable about this process. And we touched on terrain a little bit, but what features are you specifically looking for in terrain?
One thing I really like are the tops of draws. So if you have like a steep kind of drainage that's coming up, now they can cross at different portions for the most part. It's not always going to be a sheer cliff that they can't cross, but typically towards the top of it, you'll have like some sort of a little bench, and that just funnels them down on it. Not on the very top of the hills. Most of the time, it's like just I don't know, quarter way down, third of the way down that you'll start to find those things. And then like something that gets talked about all the time is saddles. Okay, but instead of hunting in that particular saddle, what I'll do is I'll go scout that and then veer off to see where those are going to or leading from, and try to find where there's the cover that makes sense for it, and everything, typically on a bench or something that kind of leaves from that location. And then also the one of my favorite terrain things is in the bottoms, actually, which is I guess not a lot of people agree with me with that, but I've killed 3 of my last 5 deer in PA in bottoms where there's points of ridges that are leading down to one central location where they're crossing from one spot to the other. and something maybe like a beaver pond or something that's funneling them. And I look at terrain, and I know I didn't answer that in a direct like, oh, it's a point or this, but there's other things I look at with terrain of like when you get into these spots of like, okay, there's some blowdowns that are laying here. Well, that's gonna probably dictate the movement, and really trying to find those things that are funneling that movement in a big area down to a smaller spot.
Yeah, so it's another measure of simplifying it. Sounds like. Um, what kind of goes off in your head when we talked about edge diversity and these other things you're looking for in foliage and such, and in the plants around, and now we talked about terrain. Your ideal situation, there's lots of situations that you may look at, either a map and in scouting, but what kind of goes off in your head when you start to combine terrain with these different things?
To me, it's just like it's just adding. I look at every like most things with deer hunting in a pros and cons list, and I want those pros to outweigh the cons. So it's like, okay, you have variation in vegetation, so that's going to create, most likely more food, more browse. It's going to create bedding habitat, and it's going to create the funneling down of deer. So I want to find, if I can find a spot where terrain meets vegetation edge, it's like that's really important to me to be able to find. And what I've also learned, especially with hunting mature deer, is a lot of times they're, unless it's like the absolute, there's like maybe 1 or 2 days a year you'll get that buck where he's just in zombie mode. I love those days where they're not worrying about as much, but mostly like they don't. If you're hunting that edge, I used to hunt where I'm like, okay, my shot is to that edge, and that's cool. But a lot of times they will work just inside that cover, those mature deer, versus even in the rut, not just out in the open on that side. So I want to place myself to where I can shoot, say, 10 yards into some of that cover, but also being on the edge. If that makes any sense from that standpoint. It's just something that I've seen and sitting in the back here, my buddy Johnny Stewart. Like one thing I've learned from him is like when we be in scouting together is just like really looking at it from like, you know, sounds weird, but pretending you're kind of a deer. And it's like, what makes sense as far as travel goes to feel confident as you're working through it, and doing that when you're in there picking those spots, and that helps with really fine tuning those setups. Because how many times you see you might see a big buck and you're like, man, he was just out of range, or he was just inside that cover and I didn't have that opportunity. It's like, how can you avoid that step and get to that point where he is within that range? And sometimes that takes literally hunting those places to learn that. Like last year, I'm sitting here talking about it, but I did the thing where I misjudged as far as where I thought these deer were going to be, and I was too far on the outside, and I had two different situations where really nice deer. One was a giant that I was after that was just inside that cover, and I was just off of that spot. But that's just a learning thing to be able to apply, going forward. But I believe like these spots just take anywhere you go, any areas, they take everyone's different. There's similar things that you can apply across the board, but it takes being in there to find the little intricacies that are within that to really be on that X.
And it sounds like you've learned a lot of these things through, like you just explained in that example, through failure. Like it sounds like you spent a lot of time in the woods, you spent a lot of time scouting, and you've learned a lot of these things through, cutting your teeth and refining your approach. Like you just took the example that, the deer was just off in that cover a little bit, and you're already applying it to things down the road. And I think that's what really separates you from a lot of other people, is that you're not just taking one occurrence and applying it to how am I going to get that buck, but you're applying it to how can I prevent errors in future bucks. And I think that is really valuable for our audience to take, is that not only your observations that you're making at the time, but applying to the deer you're hunting at the time, but they're going to apply to deer you hunt in the future. And that's just another way of, like, it seems like simplifying
Yeah,
what you're
and
hunting.
and I think that there's a lot of people can find good sign. You can find scrapes, and when you find them, it's like, okay, that's a big scrape. There's multiple licking branches twisted up. That's a good spot. But now it's like where that I think it separates actually shooting an animal there versus just getting pictures of them is that setup and how to micro break down that area. Say like one place I like to hunt a lot are like strips of vegetation between clear cuts. So you get an area where there's a bunch of clear cuts, and whether it's a SMZ, a stream side management zone, like area where there's like a lower area or a drain that goes through that they leave the timber in next to the stream system, and then the cuts will be on each side. But it's like, okay, that could be 80 yards wide. There's a lot of variation where you could mess that up as far as how they're moving. And if it's thick, he may have went past you and you didn't even see him, and you think that, oh, there was no deer that came through here today, but he may have been there. I've had that happen before where I check a trail camera on the way out, and it's like I was within 90 yards of them, and I didn't see a deer all day. Like, so that's something that I've definitely learned, and that's why it takes so much time when I find these good areas of just standing there and looking at it, and looking at it from different angles, and trying to pick those trees to be in to have that actual opportunity.
So let's kind of go into expand upon that a little bit. Specifically, when you're in an area and you're looking at all the different angles, hunting in the mountains, wind direction. How do you look at wind direction for your style of hunting and where you hunt and how it affects how you set up and what you look at, as you're kind of walking through there?
Yeah, so wind direction, like one thing I do with wind is I look at when I'm going into an area, I look at the historical wind from what it was at that time of year I'm hunting. So I think what's really important with scouting is understanding when you plan on spending the most time in an area. For example, if it's like, okay, you have time off of work that you can go hunt and it's like November, I'm gonna take a week off. I probably wouldn't focus as much time on that early October if you may hunt a Saturday here or there, as much as like I'm gonna put most of my effort into this rut sign that I'm hunting versus some of this other types of locations. But me saying that is because, like, say you go back and you look at historical wind. One thing, so I'll go into the Spartan Forge app and go back and look at the historical. You put your marker right on where the area you're in, and it'll pull the historical weather data from that. And I'll look at October, and it's like the majority of the winds are southwest, and it's like, okay, so I want to look at when I have these waypoints I marked from scouting in there. I want to look at those places that are conducive to those southwest winds. Now you can get an east wind or you can get different things, but I want to find what the most of that is going to be. And then November could be a different one. You start getting more north winds or other west winds that are coming through there, and it's like that helps a lot. Or one thing I noticed was one area I was in was getting a lot of southeast winds in October, and that was like in the last 3 years it was like southeast winds a lot, and it was a lot of my setups were focused on the westerly sides, and I'm like, okay, this helps me to be able to go in and do that. And I know that's not a specific as far as how setups go with the wind, but that's kind of how I start with looking at the historical wind to help again break down a big area into giving me 2 or 3 options in front of me. So when all of us that get it, I'm sure everyone in this room that's got it in their truck or their vehicle and go hunt in the morning, you're like, I don't know where to go. I could go here. I could go there. It just helps simplify that to help you pick those spots.
Absolutely. And that's something that some I don't know that people technically consider a whole lot. Like I know for myself, like someone showed me historical wind data on a property that we hunt at, and I had never considered that. Specifically for the time of year that we're there. I'm always looking at it as like, well, I got deer showing up here, I got deer showing up there. And I never considered looking at historical wind data, in the middle of the week when we're actually setting up stuff there.
Yeah, and I wanna add to this a little bit. Like there's obviously in the mountains that predominant wind direction is not always going to be consistent. There's so much swirling that's going on. There's so much of that, but that just gives me that idea. It's not a foolproof plan, but that gives me that idea as I'm going in and checking it. And then when I'm in them spots, I'm dropping milkweed, trying to understand how that stuff is flowing through there and having in consideration with what the thermals are doing. But I really, because you can go down a complete rabbit hole and overanalyze that to the point where you don't even know how to make a decision because the wind can be doing a lot of things. And there's so many times that I'm hunting that the wind is not doing what I want it to do, and I'm staying in that tree because there's there's not that many deer that I'm like, unless, I'm typically not hunting over where I think a buck's bedded 50 yards away from me, and if that wind blows there, then I'm screwed. So it's like a lot of times I'm setting up for what it's going to be most of the time, and trying to set up to be able to catch him as he's, before he hits my wind or whatever. And sometimes you get busted doing that, but I feel like if I got out of the tree every time the wind would shift, I should just sit on the couch because I'd never hunt. That's just kind of the way that I look at that.
Yeah. So that's a great point. And so we talked about a lot of different things with simplifying your setups and learning from things, but you've alluded to a lot of the work you're actually doing boots on the ground. And I'm wondering, after you've gone from your 30,000 foot view, what's like your plan going into a scout trip? Like, are you hitting specific spots? Are you trying to do like a speed tour in the spring? Do you summer scout? How does that change?
So most of my scouting of new areas is in the spring, before the foliage comes on. But there's two ways that I look at it. If I feel pretty good about my scouting and places I want to check out, basically I'm dropping pins. I used to drop way more than I do now. I try to keep it kind of clean on the map, just some high priority areas, and basically connecting the dots, but not staying on that plan so much that I have to, I have to make it here. I have to make it there. Let the sign tell me when I get to those areas what it looks like. Rarely would you drop a pin on a map and is that exact spot where you're going to be at. Even if it looks like a perfect terrain funnel, it may be off 100 yards or whatever it might be. So I want to get in there and look at it and connect those dots. Now, if it's an area I'm like, man, a lot of this stuff looks so similar, I can't find those places. What I'll do is just run right up the gut, as I call it, right up the valley that there's ridges, and I'll go in the creek bottoms and run those up and down, because that's where the most sign's going to be, is they're crossing from ridge to ridge, and you can see it. You can find tracks in there. There's three things that help me determine if it's worth putting more time in the area for hunting a mature deer. It's tracks, it's a big track that I can find, and typically that's going to be in muddy places. Sometimes you get up towards the top and it's so rocky, it's really difficult to find tracks. But then in those bottoms you can see that, and then scrapes that have multiple licking branches. I don't even know if the science behind this is correct, but big licking branches that are twisted up. A lot of times in Pennsylvania, at least, it's beech or hemlock, or the two big scrape trees that I will find. But bigger licking branches, higher up, twisted up, multiple years of those branches. That's a determination. It's like, okay, there's a mature buck in here. And then rubs is the last one. Although rubs are very inconsistent for me personally. Some areas I feel like I can find big rubs all over, and there's other places I hunt that don't have really any rubs, and you wouldn't even think that there's a big deer laying in there, and it's really difficult. But I've found when you have those three things, you can at least find one of those in those different areas. So that's what kind of I'm looking at to help determine if it's worthwhile putting more time in.
How do you think that sign is laid down in the case of like a high density of deer that are, like mature bucks? Do you think that sometimes you're finding less sign, even though you know there's a big buck in there because he's dominating the area? Or do you think you're finding maybe a scrape that has got a bunch of licking branches, maybe not year to year, but like a bunch of licking branches, you're finding scrapes all over the place, rubs all over the place, an aggressive sign? Do you think that's because bucks are competing with each other? And do you think that when a buck is dominating area, they may be less sign as a result?
I I, I guess the only way the way I look at that is, if I think a higher buck to doe ratio, and I find that in a lot of the big woods areas, is that, excuse me, there's not a ton of deer in total, but there's a good buck to doe ratio, which makes them have to compete with each other and laying down that sign. I brought people into areas that I've hunted, that have only hunted, ag country and stuff, and they see the sign, they're like, man, you must have more deer than what I'm dealing with, because the sign that's laid down. It'll be a lot of sign, and you might find 100 scrapes in certain areas, and that doesn't mean there's more deer. It's just like it seems like they're trying to show their dominance a little bit more.
You got one? Okay, good. I thought you were pointing to take a question. Um, so you found a lot of this sign. You've kind of taken either a direct approach where you're going right to where you thought, or you're taking that inside out approach where you're starting in the bottom and moving off based on rubs, or sorry, tracks, scrapes, then rubs. Um, what are you looking for setups? Are you determining where you're going to set up at that time in the spring? Uh, what's your process when you found an area that clicks for you?
Yeah, I mean, the first time into an area, it's really difficult for me to be like, I get to a good sign and be like, all right, this is where I'm going to set up because I don't know what's beyond that. But what I will do if I find really good sign that looks good, I'm going to pick a tree right then and mark it down. So I take a really detailed approach in that. I'll take 30, 45 minutes in an area looking, trying to pick trees, different scenarios. I might pick 2 or 3 trees around this central location. And I take a picture of the tree, I mark it on my pin in the app, and I write down, okay, I think I need to be about 3 sticks high, get in here on the backside facing northwest, and this is the wind direction. I put all those details in there because maybe everyone else is better than I am at it, but remembering those details kind of goes out the window when you start covering a bunch of locations. But I'll do that even when I'm not finished with that scouting because I used to be like, oh, I'll come back to this, and then you don't, and then you're trying to figure it out at 5 o'clock in the morning when you go in to hunt, and I can't remember what tree I picked to get in, even if I marked a pin, but just trying to find it, it just reduces that stress of being able to find that and be able to get in. So that's something I'll do, but I'll go through that entire area and maybe it's like, okay, I found 5 spots I really liked. But now when I'm looking at the big picture of the map, it might be like, oh, 1 and 4 weren't really the best options, but these other three, man, like those are good options. So then that's when I'm, looking at those are the highlighted spots that I want to look at, and I add that to my hunt plan and have the details of the wind and what it's going to look like to hunt those particular locations, the time of year when I think it's going to be the best. And a lot of that comes down to assumption because you don't know, especially in the first year into that. And I truly I truly believe that no matter how much you do it, it really takes 3 years to figure out an area good. Like you can kill a deer first year into a spot. 100, I'm not saying that, but to really learn how they're using it and everything, I think it takes a few years.
Good deal. Oh, did you have something? Okay.
Okay. I was going to say the next thing we're going to dive into is actually that 3-year rotation timing and how you determine a lot of that stuff. As you were going to allude to,
Yeah.
we're going to ask for questions right now. We have another point in this podcast that we're going to ask for some questions.
Oh,
We might
wow.
not be taking everything. We might not be taking every single question right now, but if you guys are shy about asking questions, keep in mind a lot of this is recorded. So all the times that you guys are listening to Beau on a podcast and you're screaming at your TV or you're screaming at your phone saying, why isn't he just asking this question? Or why isn't someone asking Beau this question? If you guys do ask these questions, you're answering a lot for a lot of our listeners right now. So feel free to ask a question. We have a mic going around. Just hold it right up to your chin about an inch away and we'll get Beau to answer for you.
All right, so I'm going to take it back to the beginning of this conversation or early on. Beau, you were mentioning, I think the last, at least 3 of the last 5 bucks you killed down the bottoms. What kind of conditions in hill country, big wood settings do you need to have in order to have confidence setting up in the bottoms?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, the bottoms are typically calm days and colder days is when I find the most consistency to that what the wind because a lot of times the bottoms create swirling effects, but also the bottoms I'm looking at aren't the ones that come super steep that touching the bottom. They have a little bit more of a wider bottom. That I mean, I don't want to give an exact as far as like, oh, it's got to be 20 yards wide or 40 yards wide, but you kind of got to look at how it is and dropping milkweed and seeing it. But one approach that I've found, and actually I talked to a guy here yesterday that said he used this and shot a buck this past season was hunting directly on the water source that is going down through there because streams or yeah, any kind of streams or spring seeps that are coming down through. Sometimes they might only be a couple feet wide or 3 feet wide that are coming down through, but that's going to create a thermal pull on those calm days that you might walk over to that wall there and the wind's blowing this way, but you get right there on that stream and you drop milkweed and it starts to flow that way. And then all of a sudden it starts getting lower and it sucks down into the water. So all those setups I was talking about were within either on the bank of that water or really close to it to be able to have that ability. And then especially like in the evenings, things about an hour before dark get calm. Even on windier days, that those things just seem to die down right before dark, and that helps have that consistency. A deer in 2022 that I shot in that situation was, I was there and I climbed up. It was like 2 o'clock, November 4th, and I climbed up in this tree. I moved from a different spot that I wasn't feeling good about, and I climbed up in there, and I'm like, man, this wind's going this way, that way, this way, and I'm like, it's not pulling down like I was hoping it to, but because it was probably wind speeds of, I don't know, 9, 10 miles an hour. Typically, I'd like it underneath 5 for those situations, but right before dark, it was supposed to calm down, and that's what it did. And it calmed down, was going down this direction, and that deer came from that way, but just out, you know, I don't know, it was a 12-yard shot is what it ended up being, but he came in, and that's where I shot him there. Did that answer kind of what you're looking for?
Got a question or? Oh. thought somebody- All right, Bo. So I'm thinking early season. Um, we hunt similar areas, clear cuts and stuff. How many stand locations or like spots do you have picked out, like going into the first week of the season? I know it's like for me, it's tough if you have a cut getting in and out, leaving your scent, or like the deer feeding there in the dark and spooking deer coming out of your location. So like in my head, I had a few spots last year lined up, but spooked a deer here. They started logging an area in another area. So like right away, my spots, early season spots, disappeared. Like it's like how many spots going into the first week of the season, like October 5th to the 10th, 12th, like how many locations or different stand locations or different deer do you have lined up to hunt? Like, is it like I got 5 clear cuts or 5 stand locations or like 10 spots? I'm just kind of wanting your opinion on like how many spots you have lined up for like the first week to in case something goes south.
Yeah, so that's a really good question because you're ultimately like all these things we're talking about, they don't always just work out the first time. Maybe there's more hunting pressure than you thought in those places. So I like to have at least 5 to, well, really 3 to 5 main areas, and within that 3 to 5 spots. So that, you multiply that out. What's that? Almost 25 different locations that I could potentially go. Hopefully I only ever have to go to 1 or 2, but having those backup spots that you can go to, like, I mean, I just ran into this last week where it was like a really good area that I've hunted. I walked in there and it was a piece of timber company property that was open to public hunting, that all of a sudden there's posted signs on it. It's leased out now. And I'm like, okay, well that sucks. If that was my only area, then I'd be, straight. And now it's just like, okay, whatever. I just go to other spots that I have, and having those backup areas or pressures, a big one. And I know Johnny, you specifically dealt with that last year with having some people come in and while you're hunting deer, but being able to bounce to different locations, I think is important. So like what I was talking about with going in these scouting these areas, I mean, I believe you can go through and scout these areas in 6 to 8 hours, but then like kind of bounce to other areas like on weekends that you have available or whatever time that you have available, and hit as many as you can just to have those backups.
We got a couple more questions. Yep. Yep. Oh,
What situations will make you abandon a spot or give up on a spot before you go to plan B?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's the $1 million question that I question even with myself a lot. But what I've kind of come down to is what happens when you're in a place, and a lot of times in these areas, I may go 2, 3 days and not even see a single deer, and it's pretty easy to start getting down on yourself and being like, is this actually a good spot? Is it dried up? Should I move on? And I literally, this is simple for myself of like, what are the pros? Why am I here? And what are the cons that are in front of me? And looking at like, okay, this outweighs it. For example, I'll give you an example. And the example I just talked about shooting that deer in 2022, I left a location that I've been hunting for 3.5 days in the middle of the afternoon when I was planning on sitting all day because I was going through there. I'm like, all right, what were the pros? In the past, this is a really good spot during the rut. It was a funnel of hemlocks on a side hill between a clear cut and then a little like kind of open swampy field that had some goldenrods and stuff in it. It was like the perfect funnel. And there had always been movement in previous years through there. Why am I not seeing anything going through there? So the pros were the historical knowledge. I knew there was nice deer in there and that eventually it'd probably get good. But I said, what were the things that have changed or what are the cons that I can see? Well, I'm not even seeing any does. I haven't even seen doe sign, even walking in or anything with my headlamp. I'm like, okay, that's a problem during the rut. And then I looked at and it was like, okay, they had just clear cut the top and now and created these additional roads that were going through and there was tree stands all over there that caused additional hunting pressure and also what the temperatures were in the 70s, so it was like it's pretty hot and it was consistently with that. I'm like, I need to get down in the bottoms where it's cooler during that time frame. So it was like all of those things that the cons outweighed the pros in that situation. So that's when I would go and leave versus because it is hard to gain that confidence in a location, but really it's just kind of looking at what do I know from the past and what do I know from my scouting and then what is actually being presented in front of me here to make it worthwhile. That's kind of how I look at it. I don't know if that answered your question.
How you doing? We're from Michigan a lot, and we hunt a lot of like more flat land, and we find that we're bouncing around quite a bit. And when we're going to be hunting more southern Indiana in the hills this year, and we're listening to some podcasts by Paul Patera, and he's one of the things that he was saying. A lot of mobile guys, when they go into an area, they abandon it too quickly. What's your opinion on knowing when to move and when not to move based on sign or deer movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, Paul and I talk about this regularly. When I guess I've always been hunting mobile, if with a climber or whatever it might have been, or at the time we were talking about this last night. Actually, I was laughing at how great all the gear has come along from my steel climber that the straps would dig holes in my shoulders when I was carrying it in. But all that to say, once I got into saddle hunting, the first time I started taking in everyone talking about first sit, best sit, got to move around, all that stuff, and I'm like, man, I'm doing something. I gotta change some things up. And I started just because I could, moving around a lot, and just I'd have all these good spots, and I was moving. And I believe that in the areas in the hills and the big woods, these deer aren't on these patterns that are going through. And most of the time, you're not boogering it up, especially you're paying attention to how you're accessing and leaving a spot. That it's better for me to sit in a spot for 3 to 4 days than to be bouncing around all the time, even though you want to. But if you even if you don't, if you have enough confidence to be sitting there in the first place, I think 3 days is a really good number to sit there before moving, even if you don't have those pros and cons lists that I was talking about because you don't have that history with it. So that is super helpful for me of like, okay, I'm here for a reason, but I need to spend time in this. And once I went back to it, it was like, okay, back in the way that I was hunting before, and even in earlier in the season, the same way, especially during the rut, but even earlier in the season, because I look at it. So say you had a map here, and this deer is going like this. He's going all over. Say GPS points, and they're moving all over the place. Well, it's like if you're chasing, it's like how often are you guys going to actually match up? Versus if you're here, eventually, it's gonna hit that spot if you feel like it's a good location. And that's how I look at it, of spending more time in there. But like say if you're going down, say you're going to Indiana and you're going to hunt the hills, you've never been there before. Personally, the way I look at that is I'll go in and spend a lot more time scouting, say the first day or two of that trip, to try to find those spots that I can gain some sort of confidence in because of the way things lay out, and then spend the time sitting there versus the first spot you come across and then you sit 3 days there and it might not be as good as you thought, and to be able to do it. I don't know if that made sense.
Oh, got another question over here.
What's up, Bo? So kind of spinning off of that, but not so exact the same. Going say Southern Indiana, are you looking for, say, on your first day of scouting? Is there specific, like Jake kind of asked this, but not so much particular to like say the first 5 days of season or early October, just per se. Are you looking for like anything specific as far as are you hunting more so terrain features that you believe in? Are you hunting in the sign that you're looking for? Like, are you looking for specific rubs, tracks, scrapes that are active? Are you, is it more terrain featured or is it more like red hot sign? And then spinning off of that a little bit, um, are you seeing more of your deer? Like, I know crops can vary from tops to bottoms. Are you seeing more of your deer come back from the tops and, in the morning, or are you seeing them come through the bottoms in the morning? Like, can you kind of hit some of those points for us?
Yeah, I guess let me ask. I want to ask him a question back here first. Did you say that you were hunting in early October, or you're
Yeah,
saying?
this would be like an early October. That's kind of the scenario I'm giving you because, like he's,
Yeah.
we're used to hunting marsh and like, you walk in early October and you find that red hot thrashed up sign all over the place. You can set up on it. The hills, we've heard, the sign can be sporadic. Some guys just like hit their terrain features that they believe in or hub scrapes or something like that. Like, are you diving right into those right away? And on your scouting, you say you spend your first day scouting. Are you diving right into like that kind of thing? Or are you kind of sitting back and watching and then moving in? Like, first sit, best sit, I get that too. So it's kind
Yeah.
of a
Yeah, it's tough to the where the as far as if they're in the bottom or the top and kind of coming through it. I think that really, I mean, it's really going to depend on what that food looks like. But in that time frame, I'm trying to figure out what is the hot food source per se. It may not be, that there's no cornfields or anything that are there, but it's like there's usually some sort of thing, like even like in areas that I hunt that have no oak trees, and it's like in these clear cuts, they love the blackberry briars that time of year, and it's going to be very specific on the location and what vegetation or tree types and stuff's there, but trying to find what that food source is and then playing off of that to be able to go in. But I do see, if I were to give an answer as far as top or bottom, I see them coming from the bottom going up more so in the mornings than vice versa. But then in the evenings, a lot of the times where I'm hunting, there's a lot of the food sources are on top. So sometimes in that early time of the year, I'm talking about that they'll kind of go up over or drop down and then go up to the next hill. Sometimes they're not bedded just below that food source per se. So it's really going to be very situational on what that food is doing. I don't really have a rule of like, okay, I'm going to hunt terrain or I'm going to hunt, that food. I got to kind of see it. I know that's not a very great answer for you there, but to be able to understand what that food is and what they seem to be feeding on. And it might even, like I said, it might be those browse things. So say you find some oaks that are dropping there. I want to work backwards from that a little bit. Now it's tough when you're going to be hunting at the same time. You can't just scout all over like you would in the spring, but working back to see like, okay, where's that secondary thing that they're going to hit before they get to that particular location? And that's where I want to hunt.
So we're gonna take more questions later, and we'll get to it towards the end here too. But you guys are asking awesome questions, I gotta say, and it's going into a lot of the stuff that we want to talk about too. So this is actually a perfect segue. Thank you for those questions, everyone. Um, but we were going to talk about your 3-year rotation, and with that 3-year rotation, we were potentially going to miss the point of talking about going out of state and getting on sign on the spot. And sometimes it happens when, I have friends that have, like you said, Johnny, clear cuts and, just the area you're planning on covering is just getting wiped out. And so, sometimes you got to start fresh, you run out of options, and now you're in season. What are you going to do, either in state or out of state? So a lot of times people ask, when is the point in which you stop? And I know that's a big, like, varying question, but when you're out of state and you're scouting your way in, how worried are you about bumping a deer? And then if you do bump a deer, how are you using that situation to your advantage?
Yeah. So what, bouncing off the question we just got here of like when I was saying how I'd go from that primary food source to into where that next spot is, if I can't find that, it's not very clear. It's like, okay, there's some green briar that are leading out as, a nice terrain feature I think a deer could be bedded on. I don't know that. Typically, I'm probably going to end up going too far and bumping them, and I'm okay with that because it at least tells me that there's a deer there. And I just find in these areas that if they escape and then you didn't like almost step on them, then they might be gone for a little bit. But like for the most part, they're circling out and gonna come back to that location. It's pretty hard, in my opinion. It's pretty hard to drive a deer out of a location when his sign worked. Like, and I see this all the time with cameras. There's so many times I'll see deer running on my cameras, not even during hunting season. It's like they're getting spooked by things all the time. They're getting spooked by coyotes. They're getting spooked by bears, whatever it might be. That's doing that, but they're not leaving those areas and finding a new spot every time. So that, to me, I'd rather bump them than not know where they're at all. And that's kind of how I look at it. And like I said, sometimes that can bite you, but for the most part, I feel like that gives me that confirmation that I'm looking for. And then maybe even if you did bump it, you go to another spot and you find similar type things. Now you know where to stop before you get there. I was last year I was scouting a place in season, and I hadn't really even hunted it much at all. I had never hunted it before that, actually, but I had scouted in the spring, put some cameras up, and it was middle October, and I was just going around checking cameras, and I checked it. I was like, holy cow, there's a big deer that was on this camera. I'm like, I got to figure out how to hunt it. But I had no past, knowledge on it. And I started going, and I hit this spot towards this point, and there's hemlocks on this side hill, and there was just like this perfect spot right before it dropped off, and I found a signpost rub and this big scrape, and it hit me all at one point, like I either went too far or this is perfect. And as soon as that happened, a deer blew and heavy hooked and jumped down over the hill, and I was like, crap. And this is where I did, but I wasn't really even planning on necessarily hunting, but I was like, okay, I'm like, dang it. I mean, he seemed like he busted out pretty hard. I'm like, it was like an hour and a half before dark, and I'm like, all right, I'm probably gonna I'm gonna hunt near here because there's a chance that he just kind of wraps around, but I'm not gonna hunt right here. And that was actually a mistake. I should have just set up right there because I moved just down over the hill thinking maybe he was gonna wrap around or something. And what do you know, that right before, like almost like couple minutes left of shooting light, he went in and worked that scrape to check out what was there. He was kind of curious because he didn't win me, and it was really interesting to be able to see that. But that was again one of those confirmations where I wasn't set up in that exact right spot, but that was another learning lesson of like, just because you blow them out doesn't mean you're screwed for that day.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I you kind of jog my mind when you bring up that point of not thinking that deer are getting spooked as hard as a lot of people give credit for. When we assume that a deer is not going to return to an area, we're assuming that the deer understands that we are going to return to that area. And when you look at the way like predation moves throughout the woods, it's not as habitual as like a human instinct would be. So it's kind of interesting to think that a deer is going to completely abandon an area, the common theory is if it bumped at all, it's gone, it's not going to be back for a long time. It's going to shift and whatever. I think we're kind of making the assumption there that the deer knows that us humans are stalking it and are going to continue stalking it, and we're going to continue to target it in that area. And I'm not sure that's.
Think about like the way I look at it. Okay, say my house, all right? Someone tries to break into my house. My security system goes off. They take off running. Am I going to sell that house and move right then? Well, now if someone breaks into my house 3 times, it's like, all right, I should probably get out of this area. It's not too great of a home anymore. But like that's just kind of how I look at it when it comes to that.
Yeah, and you're probably keeping a close eye on that front walk and making sure you're. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you're going to be a little bit more aware at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So now going into your 3-year rotation, how are you? I know you use trail cameras a lot, stuff like that, but how are you determining, like, what is your ideal circumstance for a 3-year rotation? What do you want to figure out in order to know that you're going to be effective on your 3-year plan, essentially? And how are you gaining that information that's going to help you get there?
Yeah, so and I'm gonna take the out of state trips out of this at the beginning and just focus on if it's your home state and that you're hunting and you're like you can go back, year after year and you're hunting these things. But a lot of times the first year I'm scouting a place, I'm not going to hunt it unless there's a situation where I do get a picture of a really big deer and I'm gonna try to figure it out on the fly. But most of the time it's like I'll have 3 to 5 areas that I mainly hunt, and then I have 3 or 4 new areas that I'll scout, and I'll just put test cameras there. Like maybe I'll run 3 cameras in an area on prominent sign just so I can start to learn knowledge. So next year I go back in, I can analyze that data. It's like, okay, this is a spot worthwhile. It's like, holy cow, that 3rd week in October, it was like these bucks showed up out of nowhere. Why are they there? What are they doing? I need to put more time in and potentially start hunting at that point to get into those places. So I just feel like in all these areas, like I mentioned earlier, so many intricacies within each of those spots that it just takes time to learn it. So I'm not trying to rush the situation, but I mean, honestly, it does, even on out of state trips, a lot of times if I'm planning on going to hunt a state, I really want to make it where it's like that I'm going to go back another year, like a state like Iowa or Kansas, you can't because of the points, but places that you can go to year after year, I want to try to learn more with it. But on an out of state trip, the difference is you're actually hunting it that first year because that's what you have to do versus other places where you have options that you already have history with that you can go back to and then use those as backup plans at first until they become the primary.
I got you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So are you developing your timing for these areas kind of on a rotation with cameras? So say you got a deer that's showing up and it's in relation to does and he's showing up maybe 3 out of 5 days. What do you do at that point when it comes to that occurrence? And how are you taking all this camera data you have and then narrowing it down to the time that you have to be there?
So I physically have a map where it's like there's certain dates that are highlighted and have like okay spots in there like these were good, but I'll look back to it like what were the weather conditions. Sometimes dates are all you really need, and there's other time that there's the weather conditions that influx it. I just went through the last 5 years of my trail camera data here recently, and I was just from a very high level of just like what days were deer moving, what times of the day, and I plotted them on a chart. And I was looking at November 2nd was huge on this one, and I'm like, why was this so much better? And I looked at there was one year that had I don't know, it was like 70% of those photos were in one year because there was a major snowstorm the night before. So that kind of caused a little bit of a bump that normally wouldn't be there. Now, obviously November 2nd is probably gonna be pretty good no matter what. But like I look at those dates and try to line them up to see if there's weather patterns that are associated with it. So if I was like, okay, I have, a long weekend that I can go hunt, or I can take 3 days off of work and go hunt it. I want to be around those dates. It doesn't mean every year, October 18th, that a nice buck's going to hit this scrape, but there's a reason that he's coming through to maybe check those doe groups or something. So somewhere in that 3 or 4 day window around that date time frame, and if you can get a weather pattern that was similar to line up to it, that's what I look at. But I'll plot those on a calendar to be able to see places. So then as I'm going through the season and I can remember, it's like, okay, this spot was hot, and I can go in and hunt those places, and it helps give me direction on times of the year and when I'm available to be able to hunt, because I do see those consistencies with dates and weather conditions more so than anything I see consistent in the big woods.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I love that you're combining weather with that too. And like I think a lot of time we just look at historical data in the lens of what happened last year is going to happen again this year, but you're considering weather, you're considering all sorts of precipitation shifts, things like that, and
Yeah, but I like so the way I'll look at it with specific deer, I get really analytical on it, but you can like I'll look into what the weather was doing, the wind directions, any of that details on those specific deer, but you can over analyze things by looking at way too much, and it's just like what are the things that I think are the most prominent as dates and weather. So it's just like what are those two things that are lining up, and within weather it's really temperature and precipitation for the most part that I'm looking at. Scrapes, days after rain, days after snow are seem to be always really good from that standpoint. And so I look at that, and those are the two main things I look at with that data, because I used to go way further down the rabbit hole that sometimes can overcomplicate it.
Yeah. Yeah. You know how I do that quite a bit.
Yeah, we all do it.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like you're doing a lot of things that are just great for obviously, like we said, taking big woods and simplifying it like crazy, and everything you're talking about, with the exception of the out of state and the specific deer and things like that. It sounds like you're patterning areas and you're patterning timing versus patterning specific deer on a specific occurrence. And I think that allows you to become a better hunter over time. And these questions I'm most excited to ask you about is you've not only become a very good hunter, but you've gotten very good at becoming a good hunter, if that makes sense. Like you've learned that you need to challenge yourself in these certain ways and learn these skills in order to become better. And you've kind of honed that process for whatever situation you're putting yourself in. You're not only getting better at hunting that situation, but you're evolving as a hunter as you're doing it. And your ideas are changing. And you're staying open to what you're seeing. Talk a little bit about what it takes to gain that confidence, what it takes to become more of a jack of all trades, what risks you may be taking, what you would encourage maybe a new hunter listening to this that not only wants to kill a deer this year, but just become a better hunter over time.
Yeah, and I do want to, before I answer that question, I want to go back when you were saying how I'm patterning areas, more so than the specific deer. One thing I'll say is by patterning areas, you can also have that knowledge on specific deer, even if it's because you learn that what a big deer did 5 years ago, even though he's dead, another big deer may do similar things and use his bedding areas and use the same scrapes that are regurgitated through, and I see that a lot. Like,
So you're like patterning a mature buck's behavior and then
yes,
applying that behavior
Vers-
over.
yes, and that's, I'm not saying that's always the best way of targeting a specific buck. That's just how I do it. But I'm also very rarely are you gonna find me just shooting one specific deer. I hunt one deer and then shoot other deer that I'm okay, that I'm happy with, that are in what my goals are particularly. But that's just how I go about and treat it. But
Yeah.
to go back to the gain the confidence on the consistency thing, it sounds so simple, but it's just the repetition over and over again and screwing up so many times but you learn from it. Like if you go in, you screw something up 5 times and you didn't learn from it, you still keep doing the same thing. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe I need to reevaluate that a little bit. But I mean, I don't know. I guess from everything I can look back on, it's just like I have so many things in my memory bank of where I screwed it up. But if you're, in my opinion, you're too cautious and you're not willing to take risk and try something, then you don't know that you don't know what you don't know. So like you go in, and a lot of my stuff is high risk, where it's like sometimes I'm bumping them out, but then other times I'm killing that deer. So it's like you're learning from that and then taking those things and applying it. And I think that compounds over time to have those consistencies and being able to find that.
Yeah, and we talked about this earlier, but like we talked about confirmation bias and how you actually learn more, even when you're trying to like figure out a pattern or something like that in numbers or whatever. You actually learn more from your failures going against what you thought would happen sometimes than you do your successes. And a lot of the times, I hear people ask you questions, and everyone wants to know the question is when do you stop? Like, and they're very very worried about the riskiness of a situation. And I really like that you touched on how much you stand to gain from being more risky and from potentially failing, but logging those in a memory bank and deciding to learn from them in the future. I think that's really, really, really valuable. That's something I would emphasize.
There's a big difference between recklessness and aggressiveness too.
Yes.
So, it's like, if my wind's blowing directly into this area where I'm following in, well, that's kind of being reckless at that point as I'm walking in and scouting. And you may not even see that deer that you blew out because you just, that in that situation, to catch your wind and sound and everything, it's like, okay, that's a little bit more risky than sneaking in and maybe blowing them out just because he heard you snap a stick or something.
Yeah, you're taking very
Or saw you, yeah.
yeah, you're taking very calculated risks, and you're doing them for the purpose of learning information that you need, or you want at least, in order to pattern a specific buck or an area.
And I want to say too, like one of the things that I've struggled with is you find a spot, you find it in the spring, you find it wherever, you get a picture of a big deer on the spot. I get it in my mind a lot. Like I get married to that location. I'm like, man, this is the perfect spot. I'm gonna kill him. But a lot of times I've learned it's just like try to let the woods tell you what's going on and not get so set in on that particular location and having it in your mind. So that's just something I wanted to add there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm going to give you a really, really odd theoretical question here. But let's say you were off hunting somewhere in PA in your home state, and you were in a really remote area and you had a clearing and you just shot a giant buck and you tagged out, right? And so you don't know how you're going to get out of here. And luckily, you know someone, probably Johnny, that has a hot air balloon. They come down, pick you up in the hot air balloon, and you're hauling off your buck. You're tagged out for the year. You guys are sharing a beer. You're happy as hell. You're flying in this hot air balloon. You're going over this vast expanse of public land, and in this clearing, in this area you've never covered, you see just the biggest buck you've ever seen in your life. And you guys are half mile in the sky and you can see its rack. And so you know nothing about this area. You know there's a giant deer in there, and you just killed your deer in the rut. You know that deer's using it during the rut. Really quickly, to relapse through all the stuff that we've talked about, what are you going to go do in order to kill that deer the next year? How are you, we can quickly run through what we've touched on, but you're going to identify, terrain, and then you move through that and you're scouting. In your ideal season, how do you go kill that thing the next year?
I think first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that exact spot. Well, I'm going to look at maps first, but I'm going to look at maps and try to identify places I think he may be coming from or going to based off the vegetation features there, how terrain is going to dictate that travel and he's moving there. But I want to go where my starting point is going to be, where I saw that deer at. Why was that deer there? Maybe it was just because a random hot doe ran him through there, but I don't know until I see it. But having gone through on the maps and looking at what are the, where are the vegetation differences that are around that area, maybe it's right on that X. I don't know until I look at it, and then how they're going to travel through it. And I kind of like picture in my mind, and most of the time you're wrong at first, but trying to figure out how they're moving through it, and I just picture it in my head. And then I go in there and I'm going to go in and scout and try to find that sign that starts leading me down that rabbit hole. But just because I saw him there doesn't mean that that's where I would be hunting at specifically. But looking at the area, and say if it was during the rut that you gave the example, or in your story, or that it was the rut that you saw him there, it can be super tough to be like, does that deer come from 7 miles away, or is he actually living in there? So first and foremost, I'm going to try to figure out around that rut time frame, was he doing? Because that's going to be the easiest option, because I know he was there at that time. And then if I have more time to dive into the area or the surrounding areas, then maybe I'm starting to look at what would make him be in this area or a different area at different times of the year, and going through and locating it.
Yeah, and it's just kind of an oddball analogy. For a lot of times we get the random picture or the random occurrence, or you
Yeah.
see that deer across the road or something like that in an area that you're not familiar with, and now all of a sudden you got to get on them. But let's say that you did the work, you found your preliminary setup, you think that this deer is coming through. Let's say that deer's coming through on November 2nd, and that's how he's been consistent for forever. And now you've gone on that 2-year cycle. Somehow he's gotten bigger every year, and you're on your 3rd year, and that deer is now consistently hitting an area November 2nd. How are you going to hunt that area? Let's say that 3 days in a row you have the same conditions. So let's not go into the weather conditions
Yep.
of his occurrences.
I'm gonna be there from October 30th, 31st through November 4th or 5th if I can, that whole week around that date versus just that day specifically. And that's when I want to be hunting in there. And I talked about earlier about hunting in the same spot for multiple days. Now, what throws this off? Everyone always asks me, what happens when the wind changes? Well, it doesn't mean I'm wearing the bark out of this exact tree every single time. I might move 30, 40 yards in around that area, or maybe even 80 yards over, but just to be able to hunt that feature or that thing that makes me be there. It doesn't mean I'm in that exact tree all of those times. So I wanted to bring that up because that gets asked often on that. So,
And that's kind of where I was leading to with that.
Yeah.
Like you talked with me about refining your approach. So let's say, you see that deer shifting into that area November 1st, and you believe he's going to, again, then approach that area, but you see him from like 300 yards away, and you realize that he's using the terrain a little bit differently than you thought.
yeah, then you're gonna adjust. I'm not gonna stay in that specific tree because it's like, oh, I said I'm gonna sit in this tree, but if I see say I wasn't exactly on the X and I see a doe go through and I see a buck go through, see another buck go through. Well, I'm going to climb down and try to get over to that spot and sit there because there's obviously a reason that they're going through there. And it may just be because that hot doe went through, but it's probably not the only buck that's going to be going through there, especially when you have lower deer densities and there's not, 5, 6 doe coming in the heat at one time. Sometimes you find that hot doe, you'll see 7 bucks, which might be, there might only be 7 bucks in that whole 5 mile block, but they're all right there with that doe at that time. And that's where you can find in these areas where there's so much silence at times during the rut because there's nothing going on in your spot. But once you're in it, you're in it. And that's just kind of what I tend to see with those locations. But that exactly what that scenario you're talking about with getting that deer on your trail camera. I actually have a video coming out tonight that I did a whole series on that because it's like exactly what we do. Me and my dad went into a place that where I got a picture of a nice buck last year, and I just had one camera in the area, and it was in this bottom on a hub scrape, and it's like, okay, where's he coming from? I only had 2 pictures of him, I think, something like that, in October. So, and it's funny the video doesn't say it in there because I did it beforehand, but I'm running cameras and just this morning I got a picture of him on my cell cam, so I feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, so that's pretty, but that's kind of how I go about it. I start at that spot where they're at and then work off from it.
Awesome.
So we're going to open the floor back up for questions. If you had a question, just go ahead and raise your hand. Oh, and there we go.
Hey, Bo. A question was, you touched on wind speed earlier somewhat. So I guess this scenario would be more based around cruising bucks in the mountainous terrain. When wind speed, as far as high speed versus low speed, when your thought process might change to how that buck is going to use that ridge or the mountainous terrain, whether it be like windward, leeward, or not that it's black and white, but where your thought process might lean towards a higher percentage based on wind speeds versus low speeds, generally around like midday, or just based on what your experience is around that.
So I find on higher wind speed that it's almost more important on the leeward side. I'm not like at the leeward side of the ridge. So for anyone that doesn't know what that means, basically if you have a ridge and this way, if the wind's coming from this direction, this side of the ridge is the leeward side. So that's where they're going to be out of the wind the most for that example. And those high wind days, those I find deer moving quite a bit in high wind days because there's branches falling out of trees, and I guess that's an extreme example. But as you start getting higher wind, but if say you go back to like above 10 miles an hour or so, and it's kind of getting pretty windy, I find that leeward side to be more important. But then on calmer days and stuff, I don't find the side of the ridge to be as important as it is what the cover is associated with it. I'll find ridges that the leeward side is open hardwoods, and then the windward side is mountain laurel. Those deer are going to be probably, in my experience, have been in that mountain laurel on that side versus that open side just because the wind's good. They have the cover. They can hear if anybody's coming to them, and they have an eyesight. They have those, they have those senses in their favor more so, even though they don't have the perfect wind that's associated with it. So I don't know if that answered your question, but a lot of times, I guess with higher wind days, I don't find them on top as much as I would down over the sides in those scenarios.
One back there.
Hold it right up against your chin.
So in like agricultural areas, you have like a very defined bed to feed pattern pretty often. But you switch to the mountain terrain, and I have a lot of trouble finding where these buck are bedding at. I feel like they have multiple bed sites, and it seems like it's always changing throughout the year. Like their bed to feed pattern could be so random. If they get pressure over here, they just move to a different area that they're comfortable with. How do you go about I guess be more for early season pre-rut? How do you go about figuring out a setup based off of where that buck's bedding and where he's feeding at. Like, is there something you differentiate based like a turning feature or anything? How do you figure out where he's bedding at and feeding if it's a constant change?
So, I guess if I understood it correctly, you don't know where he's bedding at that point, but you're trying to figure it out. But you know where he's feeding at. Is that correct? Or just
Just in general, like for any, I don't necessarily have a specific buck, but
yeah,
I have trouble in areas differentiating where they're bedding and where they're feeding at, just because it seems to be constant change
yeah.
throughout the season.
So for me, the way I look at that, and I run into that scenario a lot too, where I honestly don't know where they're bedding in certain situations. But I think even in early season, what you can start to find is by scouting through those areas, finding where they're potentially feeding at based off it doesn't, whether that is acorns or maybe that's you go through and there's a bunch of briars that are browsed down and there is buck sign there that tells you a buck is feeding here at some point, working back off of that to try to find where is that those terrain features are covered that they could be. And sometimes it doesn't, I don't need to find that bed to be that confirmation. It's just like, and you think about it and say there's a point of the ridge, you always hear bucks bed on points. Well, a lot of times it's not just those major points. It might be a little bump that's coming out on a side hill that still gives them that visual advantage and has that location or that thicker cover that's associated with it. And so I do assumptions and I might find 4 of those areas. And it's like, if you back off of those bedding spots towards those places where you think that he's potentially feeding at, where are there some places where that crosses over? And typically for me, it's around a scrape. If I can find a big scrape, and that's where I want to be at, and don't really care exactly where he's bedding at, and if possible, be able to hunt that multiple days in a row, if you can, because I think they may not be bedding there 2 of the 3 days, but maybe they do use in one of those areas to be able to come through. But that is honestly the hardest time to hunt deer in the big woods, in my opinion, is that early October standpoint for that particular reason. But I rarely find bucks that are using specific beds. And an example I'll give of that in 2021, I shot a buck on opening day, and I knew where he was feeding at, and I got a picture of him from the last year crossing through this one trail going, and I actually assumed where he was bedding at, and I think I was actually wrong, but it didn't matter because I was in that crossing section of where he was going to, and I shot him that morning. It was a cold morning, like a 20-degree temperature drop for the opener, and he came back late to bed essentially, came through, and there was a beech tree that was dropping nuts in the middle by this creek bottom, and that's where I was able to shoot him at. But I don't get too worked up if I don't know exactly where that deer's laying, because I don't believe that he's laying in a same bed over and over again. I've ran trail cameras on worn down buck beds a lot of times, and I'll see does using it, I'll see fawns using it, I'll see multiple bucks using it, and that big deer might use it 3 times a month on that particular bed. So, but then there's other deer that will use the same bed multiple times, especially if they have that destination food source. Say you're talking about in the mountains and there's a patch down lower or up high of oaks that are dropping at that time. He might use that bed for, 3 out of 5 days or something. Then it's a little bit more consistent, but I wouldn't, I guess I don't worry as much about knowing where that is. And I'm trying to look at it and be like, does that make sense for a deer to lay at some time and then put in the work to do so? But I do believe that's the hardest time to shoot a deer in the mountains.
Hey, Bo. So you going back a while back, you said you talked about watching that milkweed being sucked down by a body of water, a river, creek, whatever. How fast and how big do you think that body of water has to be to not worry about your scent getting to the other side of it? And do you really worry about deer picking up your scent downstream from the stream or from the wind down by the river sucking it down?
Yeah. So I'll answer your second part first. And yeah, you can definitely spook deer downstream from doing that. It's just kind of an odds thing of like, I want to be set up below. If it's a crossing, I want to be set up below where that main crossing is. But there is sometimes where you get it where there's also crossings down below you, and it's just kind of your I guess throwing it to the wind uh, to go in there, and that's just my opinion with it. But as far as the body of water, obviously the deeper and the wider that is the better pull that you're going to have because you're having that colder body of water. And the reason why those thermals are following that is because that body of water is typically colder than what the ambient air temperature is, so that's pulling down through it. When you get down by a stream, you feel kind of that cooler air that's coming down through there. So the bigger it is, usually the better, and the faster flowing that it is, increases that. But you can have one that's as wide as this table and only this deep, but kind of flowing pretty good coming down through. That will pull, but you might have to be, within 5 or 6 feet of that bank or right on that bank for that to work. And honestly, I don't really know if there's a rule of thumb with it. I just kind of test it to see when I'm there with milkweed and figure out what's actually working with it. And there will be times even with those smaller bodies, like I gave an example earlier where it may not be all day that does pull down. There might be times when the sun's really heating things up and you're on an east or a south side of things where it's getting more sun that you might, and you're too high up in the tree and it's not really pulling like you would hope that it would. So it's very situational, but the faster flowing and the wider and deeper that it is, that's going to definitely help with that. Did that answer your question?
So how late in the summer are you going in to you scouting these areas without having to worry about doing more harm than good?
I mean, if I feel good about an area, like the last time I would go in and check it and scout it would probably be I try to like be a couple weeks before the season would open. But if I don't know things, I'll do it the day before, even so just so I have that information, even if I do end up messing things up per se. But I need to know that information. So for me, I'm less worried about that unless I know, like, or say you have a buck on camera and you feel pretty good about it, but you want to get confirmation, either go check that camera or go see if the sign's there. I would like to do that, a week or two before the season to give it a little bit of time. But things are changing so much that's my concern about doing it too early. Like, say you're like, all right, I don't want to be in there after August, but the season doesn't open till October 5th. It's like, okay, that there's a lot of time and a lot of things that are changing in there that sign may not be relevant to what I'm finding at the end of August.
Hey, Bill. Nice to see you. Is there a situation in the big woods that you would prefer to hunt on the ground, and what would that like for you?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a really good question. One place that I find ground hunting to be a part of my tactics, you get into like 25, 30-year-old clear cuts that are pole stands that are maybe this big around. There's a bunch of them through there. It's super hard, even in a saddle or anything, to get in a tree. And even if you could get in the tree, there's not cover that's coming through those areas, or you can't get up high enough. The tree's going to start, swaying back and forth. So that in those situations, I like to be able to hunt on the ground, or you get in places where there's, say, big rocks and kind of things that are going through. I have a spot this year that I plan on hunting on top of this big rock where it funnels down. There's mountain laurel on top, and there's two big rocks and a trail that comes down through. I'm just going to be up on that rock, and I may end up, just for a comfort reason, there's like a tree that runs next to it, tie my saddle to it, but not actually go any higher, just to be able to sit there. But that's an example where I would hunt on the ground, or super steep stuff that's going down through, because when you get really steep terrain, like places in West Virginia that I've hunted, and even some places in PA where you go up in the tree, you're like eye level with a deer above you, and you got a 40-foot drop that goes down there, and I don't like that angle for shooting. So in those situations, then I would also hunt on the ground. But as far as sitting in a particular place, now still hunting on the ground, that to me, that's a really good tactic during the rut when you are having those long days and you're not confident in your spots, you're not confident in what you're doing, and you need to go find it, that you can go out and scout and hunt at the same time by going through it. Like that was something I learned from my dad, and he's shot quite a few deer in this situation going through clear cuts. He'll go through quiet and sneak, but then snap big branches and grunt and have deer, kind of like they might be bedding there and like, what the heck is this? And they get up to come in, and you can get some really cool shot opportunities then by doing so. And that can actually work early season too. It's just it depends if you hit the right temperament, if they're gonna react to some of that stuff in the way. But during the rut, the testosterone is just flowing, and it makes it a little bit easier.
Who else has a question? You can raise your hand.
So, Bo, I was question for you with you running trail cameras in big woods. How much do you rely on that intel versus your scouting ventures uh, prior to the season? Being, do you? I don't want to ask this. Are you more keen to being that you grew up hunting big woods more on your scouts versus seeing what you get on trail cameras? Is it has it really helped you if you were to take away those cameras and not have that source? Would you feel that you'd be as successful as you are today?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question there, I think you as far as like how much I use cameras like in this season. So my cameras are more so set up to learn for following years more so than right now, other than like to confirm a deer is there, and to confirm a deer is there, because you can get, especially cell cameras. Cell cameras are cool because like they help without having to go in to a spot and dirty it up to be able to see what's there. But the problem is you start chasing those photos, and you're one step behind at that point to be able to do so. So in my opinion, it's like the way I use them for this season is confirming a deer is in an area. And then also another option is like when you do get closer to the rut, when you start seeing does hitting scrapes or laying next to scrapes, it's like the next few days are going to be pretty hot in that area because she's ready and she's trying to show that she's ready to be bred essentially. So that's how I would use it there. To go back to like what do I think I could be as successful without trail cameras? Probably not on big, as far as like specific deer that I'm finding, because I don't know, wouldn't know what is out there to be able to hold out for or be able to shoot. But I don't think you need trail cameras at all to be able to hunt specifically. I just think it helps for that historical knowledge to see when those areas do light up and be able to be able to do so. I mean, but also just by hunting a bunch and recognizing things. I mean, I think a lot of times trail cameras probably do hurt me at times because I'm so looking back at that historical knowledge. Where when I go out of state, I rarely am using trail cameras unless I'm planning. If I get a chance to go down in the spring, I might set some up, but it's not. That's when I go out of state, I'm not really doing that. Like when I was down in Ohio here last year and some other places, like I didn't have any cameras there, but it was still going in and be able to have opportunities. So I think for me, trail cameras really help with getting that historical knowledge and figuring out the caliber of deer that are there. So, but I do believe that by doing it for a long time, that it wouldn't necessarily affect if I'm killing deer. It just depends on which ones.
Any other questions? Y'all stick your hands up. All right, Bo, I want to ask you a question. Specifically, if you're looking at early season, pre-rut, during the rut, post-rut, what do you think is the biggest mistakes guys make when they're trying to, especially hunting public land in big wood settings, whether it's hill country or more mountainous country? What's some of the biggest mistakes they make, again, doing things repeatedly without having the end result they're looking for?
I think it's bouncing around. I mean, we talked about that, quite a bit here, but I think that is the biggest mistake I hear, and even like messages I'll get from people, and they're telling me what they're doing. I'm like, man, you're in really good spots, and you're doing the right thing, but you need to do more of that one thing versus bouncing between locations. And like I said, all of us, including myself, like you get in, it's hard to do, but I think that is the number one thing that I see is not giving a spot enough time. And that is definitely just overthinking and needing to be in different places or chase after things, just giving a spot more time.
Any other questions? All right, Rick, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, guys, Beau, this has been a great time. I mean, I'm just sitting here listening most of the time because I'm just kind of enthralled and excited about it. But I really appreciate you coming out here and doing this and taking everybody's questions. Thanks for an awesome seminar, man.
No, thanks everyone for coming here, and thanks to you guys for asking questions. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Make sure you go check out Timber Ninja, by the way.
Yeah.
Thanks.